Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Risk Connect web series, Risk at Work. I'm Scott Fenstermaker, Director of Digital Marketing here at Risk Connect. For those of you just joining us for the first time, Risk at Work is a new web series from Risk Connect that explores the challenges that risk and compliance professionals face every day, both on the insurable side and traditional RMIS, and also in the domain of GRC. And the mission of Risk at Work is to bring industry experts together who can offer the most practical, actionable advice for overcoming roadblocks and exploring risk-related opportunities. And our goal is that the tools and the resources that we talk about here are actionable enough to be put into practice immediately after this webinar is over to start right away generating value for your organization. Today is going to be no different. As a matter of fact, I think actionability is paramount with today's topic. Today we'll be kicking off the first in a three-part series with GRC expert Michael Rasmussen called Navigating Chaos. Over the next 3 episodes, we'll be exploring how to engage each of the 3 GRC lines of defense in the time of crisis, not only so that we can better react to what's going on in our world currently, but so that we can prepare ourselves better for crises in the future. As I mentioned, my guest today is Michael Rasmussen. Michael is the analyst of GRC 2020 research. He is an internationally recognized pundit in the area of governance, risk, and compliance, with specific emphasis on strategy, on process, information, technical architecture, and solutions. He has over 27 years experience helping organizations design and implement GRC architectures and enhanced processes. As a matter of fact, when he was with Forrester, he is the actual originator of the definition and the model for the GRC market, the term that we've all come to know and accept over the years. He is a sought-after keynote speaker, author, and advisor. I am very pleased to welcome Michael Rasmussen. Michael, please take it away.
Oh, it is a pleasure to be here today and to be able to talk with everybody virtually, about the navigating chaos. These are challenging times. And in that context, we have a 3-part series, as Scott was mentioning, Risk at Work. And we're going to talk about the 3 lines of defense. Now, just to set the stage, there's a lot of people that love the 3 lines of defense, and there's some people that, find that it's not the most perfect model. Any model can be picked apart. And so I take the 3 lines of defense because it is a good concept to be able to communicate different roles and responsibilities for risk and compliance and controls, and be able to break out those responsibilities and how they interact with each other across those lines of defense as well. It's not perfect. I mean, we could talk about 4 lines or 5 lines of defense. We can talk about how big each line of defense should be. And there's a lot of debate there. I'm not trying to get into that. I'm just trying to practically talk about the different lines of defense and how I approach them and understand them, particularly in this time of crisis. So in that context, let's start with talking about what we're up against, what we call navigating chaos. Business is changing minute by minute, second by second. Let's even step outside of the current crisis and pandemic that we're in. Business is very dynamic, very changing. Employees are changing, regulations are changing, risks are changing, the business itself is changing, the economy is changing. And business, even outside of a pandemic crisis that we're in right now, it has to be able to navigate a lot of chaos and just the normal chaos and change of day-to-day business and regulations and risks, where the unforeseen little event can cause some significant issue in the organization. It was just several years ago that Target had a breach in which a HVAC vendor, a heating and air conditioning vendor for Target, had a connection to the Target network for environmental monitoring. A hacker was able to compromise and break into the heating and air conditioning vendor, was able to compromise point of sale systems across Target. That's how complex our organizations are today and interconnected and navigating chaos. Who would have thought that the heating and air conditioning vendor could be the doorway into a significant breach? But then, you have the Internet of Things, and that microwave in the break room could be the next breach of data. Or that blender in that contractor's office. I'm not kidding. My wife and I went to the Wisconsin State Fair and upgraded our blender last August. Our blender is connected. I can program it with my iPhone. If my blender has a security vulnerability or an issue, it could compromise my home network and therefore my laptop, and therefore the client data and connections I have with my laptop. That's navigating chaos today. But chaos is more than just IT security. I've been talking about this for years. I've been talking about how too many enterprise risk and operational risk management programs are being held hostage by IT security. IT security is a significant risk, but there's lots of other risks that need to be seen at the table. And I've been talking about environmental risks and health and safety risks, and we're facing that now, in which with a global pandemic, and that has completely re-architected how business is functioning today. And how much of that will be temporary and how much will go into long-term as far as work from home and how people interact and things. I mean, a lot is changing in the digital world because of a health and safety crisis right now. And we need to be able to manage and navigate the crisis of this current pandemic and its impact on the business and be able to manage that in our organizations. And that's our particular challenge that we're facing right this very minute. You know, Leonardo da Vinci stated, realize that everything connects to everything else. You know, we have what we call chaos theory. The theory of the butterfly's wings in the Netherlands makes tiny atmospheric changes that can influence the development and path of a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. Who knows? Hurricane Dorian that devastated the Bahamas several months ago could have started with a butterfly in Amsterdam. But those little things matter. In our current pandemic, you know, a bat at a wet market in Asia, you know, can lead to a global flu pandemic. Those little things matter, and we have to be able to manage those, foresee those in our organizations. And we need to be able to understand this across all the different lines of defense. That's the complexity. I often use the story of the Titanic to illustrate the interconnectedness of risk. You know, Captain E.J. Smith of the Titanic stated that he has never in a wreck and never had been wrecked and could not foresee of any vital disaster happening to the Titanic. Yet it sank on its maiden voyage. The front page of the newspaper said the Titanic was unsinkable. Again, it sank on its maiden voyage. What went wrong? Well, you had overconfidence in the ship's design. How often are we overconfident in our business? And our CEO is overconfident in our organization. You had to push to get across the Atlantic quickly to show its speed and power of the day. How often is that our challenge? You know, that we're pushing the business too fast. There's external environmental factors bearing down on the Titanic. In 1912, there's already some period of climate change and the northern Arctic ice shelf is breaking up. Icebergs are coming further south into the Atlantic. And on top of that, the tidal moon poles of January, February, March 1912 were of a stronger nature, bringing those hazards of icebergs further into the shipping lanes, creating more hazards than were normally there. External environmental factors. We're facing that today. The flu pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic right now around the world, and its impact on the organization. You know, external environmental factors that hurt our organization. I've been talking about this and that we need to be able to manage these other perspectives on risk, and balance our enterprise and operational risk management programs out. But a lot of organizations have stuck their head in the sand and haven't looked at these other risks. You know, they didn't have the proper number of lifeboats and life preservers for the number of passengers on board. There was health and safety risk. They tell us that the size of the rudder and propeller were undersized to the massive size of the ship, so it was not as navigable in the waters. The Titanic had third-party risk issues. The iron ore used in the rivets to hold the various seams of the ship together was of a brittle and inferior quality. Weak iron ore in the rivets. Oversight risk. The Titanic was getting warnings from other ships that icebergs were in the area. One of the responses back from the Titanic was, shut up, we're tired of hearing about that. You know, we've been hearing for a few months about the pandemic. How often were our businesses ignorant and not paying attention? And then we're caught off guard. The Titanic had technology to scan the ocean for hazards like icebergs. High-tech technology back in 1912 was called binoculars. The crew member that had the key to the cabinet where the binoculars was kept was assigned duty to another ship right before it set sail and took the keys with them. How often are companies using strong, good risk technology like our host Risk Connect only for a partial fragment of what it could be used for? It's not being properly used in the environment. Lastly, the Titanic was headed towards an iceberg. If it would have hit it dead on, only 2 compartments would have flooded. When it tried to navigate, and remember the propeller and rudder were undersized to the massive size of the ship, and it wasn't as navigable, and it brushed along the sides, combined with the weak iron ore in the rivets, 6 compartments flooded and the ship sank. but the ship sank slowly. There's time to get off the boat, but people didn't have the health and safety equipment. It was an interconnected risk environment. And we need to be able to see these interconnections and the risks in the organization today. The physicist Fritjof Capra stated, the more we study the major problems of our times, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent. The physicist here was talking about biological ecosystems, but the statement so applies to organizations today is that we have to understand, our challenges, our issues, our risks, and the interconnections and interdependencies of our risks in our organization. And that includes understanding them across what we would call the 3 lines of defense. And let's look at this backwards. The 3rd line of defense is that role of internal audit and providing assurance for the organization. And some of you on the phone are probably from that 3rd line of defense. Others, probably the majority of the people watching this webinar, are from the 2nd line of defense, from risk management, enterprise, operational risk, corporate risk management, insurance. It could be corporate compliance and ethics functions, IT security, quality, environmental health and safety. They're the people responsible for managing and monitoring risk day in and day out. That's the 2nd line. The 1st line of defense, and what we're focusing on in this first webinar, is typically defined as operating management. But I think that the 1st line of defense is so much more than that. And that's one of the areas where I differ on the traditional 3 lines of defense model. Because the 1st line of defense does include operating management, but I would say that it includes everything down to the frontline employee. The doctor and nurse in our hospitals right now around the world are making risk and compliance decisions every moment of the day right now, and particularly around health and safety, patient safety. They're making decisions on patient privacy. The teller at the bank is making risk and compliance decisions on fraud and money handling and cash handling and money laundering. And then, the insurance agent out there in the field, the call center representative and the financial services firm or healthcare firm. The 1st line of defense isn't just about management, but it's all the way down to those frontline employees. And so today, let's talk about that 1st line of defense and understand it in context of not just operating management, but all the way down to the frontline employees in the organization, who truly are the front edge of risk and compliance and control management in any and every organization. The challenge with the front lines is a lot of times our processes and approach in communicating to the frontline employees is what I call the inevitability of failure. Too many documents and manual processes that make the engagement and interaction with frontline employees confusing. When it comes to things like risk assessments, I can think where an organization went to an RFP for GRC software like our host Risk Connect because it was the frontline employees that were screaming. They're saying this week it's a SOX 404 assessment. Next week it's a business continuity assessment. The week after that it's a risk assessment. And the week after that it's some other assessment. And they're saying these are coming in spreadsheets and documents and point solutions. And half the questions we're answering this week were answered last week. On top of that, things like policies are being managed in documents and thrown out in file shares, and they're out of date and inconsistent. This manual approach with documents, spreadsheets, and emails is a recipe for disaster. We're going to talk about this across all 3 of the webinars in this series. So stay tuned. Like in the next webinar, talking about the 2nd line of defense, there's one organization that was spending 200 employee hours to build one report on risk and compliance for the board of directors. That's not managing risk. That's reacting to risk. If once a year you're building a report that takes 200 hours to build because you got to comb through and gather and manage all the data from hundreds to thousands of documents, spreadsheets, and emails, you're reacting to risk at that point. You're not managing risk. It's the inevitability of failure when we have too many documents and manual approaches and we don't get the insight when we need it, where we need it, and we can't engage and interact with the frontline employees effectively and efficiently in a way that demands agility, but we're not delivering that. On top of that, we have too many people sending too many messages in too many different ways. Look at the little talk bubble there. You got the employee there saying, there are too many people from too many departments sending too many different messages about too many policies. I can't make sense of it all or keep myself organized. This is happening right now. I had a phone call just this past week with a financial services organization. They're pulling their hair out at the moment. They've had to restructure the organization, and people are working from home with remote home office workers. And in that context, they've had to revise policies like work from home policies, home office expense policies, and all these other things. And they're finding that they've got 20 different policy portals in the organization. And they're trying to engage and interact with the front line on these new policies. And these policies are being governed and managed across all these different departments and different portals, and there's not a consistent view of policies into the organization. And it's working against them in this time of crisis, where all of a sudden, I've been telling them for years, but all of a sudden they're waking up and saying, we need a singular view into all the official policies of the organization, the communications related to policies, and to be able to push this out to our employees in a time of crisis. Same thing when it comes to assessments. Same things when it comes to reporting issues and incidents in the organization. We need to interact and engage with the frontline employees, that first line of defense. And if we have all these scattered approaches in doing this, it is not efficient, it is not effective, and it is not agile at a time in the midst of a crisis that it needs to be. The way we've approached trying to manage and interact with the frontline employees reminds me of the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. Now, this is a sprawling mansion that was built in the 1800s. It cost $5.5 million to build then, so you calculate inflation, that's one very expensive house today. It had 147 different builders and took 38 years to build. The point is, it had no design, no blueprint, no architect. At the end of the day, it's got doors that open to walls, doors that open to 20-foot drops, skylights that are on floors instead of ceilings, staircases that go up or down to nowhere. What I just described is probably many of your organization's GRC programs. That over the last 38 years, you've had 147 different builders and departments doing their little things, and all of a sudden you come into a crisis and you need to streamline things and be able to manage things and communicate with the front line. You find out you have 20 policy portals. And there's no effective way to be able to communicate and update the policies across those portals and bring them into one singular interface for employees, because you've let the organization go in all these different directions without any consistency, without any design or blueprint. You're confusing the front line. Look at the little talk bubbles here. You have the employees saying there are too many formats. There are too many locations and different managers giving orders. Who's in charge right now in this time of crisis? Suggested procedures are vague and often conflict with what I'm being told by other departments. Which one of these is current? What's the current policy? How are things being kept current? Regulations are changing quickly right now. Some regulations are being put on pause and they're not being enforced because of the crisis. Others, there's new regulations to be able to address in a time of crisis and what regulators expect as a temporary workaround for specific areas. How are these being communicated and managed to employees out there in the front lines in this time of crisis when things are scattered? And it's becoming confusing and slowing the organization and causing more exposure and damage from this pandemic event than is needed in organizations, because the organization hasn't thought through consistently how to communicate and engage with the front lines on risk and compliance areas like policies. We need to be able to engage the first line of engagement, the front lines of the organization. I go over to London quite a bit. It doesn't look like I'll be there for a few months now, but typically it's 8 to 10 times a year. And when I go to a meeting in London, a business meeting, you often hear the British people talk about the coal face of the organization. And what they're talking about is a reference to the Welsh miners deep down in the coal mines, chipping away at the coal. And when they talk about the coal face at a meeting in London, they're talking about the front lines of the organization. How do we engage and interact with the coal face, the front lines, the doctor and nurse at the hospital, the teller at the bank, the insurance agent, the call center representative? Those frontline employees are making risk and compliance decisions every day. Right now, some of them are making many more risk and compliance decisions every minute when it comes to health and safety, and particularly the doctors and nurses in our healthcare around the world. They're making risk and compliance decisions. We need to engage and interact and provide the most efficient, effective, and agile ways to communicate to our frontline employees in a time of crisis. That is absolutely critical. And when it comes to policies with the first line of defense, the line of business from operational management down to frontline employees, whether they're accounting, sales, operations, whatever they are, need to be aware of, understand, and apply policies to their business context. And right now, that business context is changing. The way business is being done with remote office workers and things means changed processes, changed expectations, change in controls in the environment. And that needs to be clearly communicated. Policies are only effective if they are accessible and followed at all levels of the organization, particularly the frontline employees of the organization, how they engage and interact. What's also critical is maintaining culture in a time of crisis. And our culture is defined and modeled and molded by the front lines and operational management of the organization. Right now, we need to be interacting and engaging with frontline employees on matters of policies, what's acceptable and unacceptable risk, on reporting issues and incidents in the environment. And we need to be able to monitor our ethical culture. What can go wrong right now? What is right and wrong? Business processes have changed. People are working from home. What is the right and wrong way of dealing with information and processes in our organization in the midst of a changing crisis and pandemic with changed business processes as a result? How do we maintain our ethical culture when people aren't in an office and they're distributed and they're working from home? What type of access to information do we give to them? How is that information managed in the organization? What's our risk culture? The economic environment's changing. The risk culture is changing. We need to be able to monitor and manage our environment currently today in context of the risk today. What was an acceptable risk a month ago might not be an acceptable risk today because the economic environment's changed significantly and a lot of other risks out there. And so what is our current risk culture and what is acceptable and unacceptable risk? How do we communicate and engage those frontline employees on what is expected of them and what risk is acceptable and what is not acceptable, from health and safety risks to IT security risks? There are things that have to be looked over at times to be able to support a remote workforce. All the IT security issues that we had before, sometimes, when we're dealing with trying to get people up and running at their home offices, we're not going to have the same level of IT controls and things in those remote environments. How do we deal with that? What is our risk culture? What's acceptable and unacceptable risk? What's the tone from the top in the governance culture? How's that being communicated? Are our executives and all levels of management supporting policies, enforcing policies, reminding employees on policies? Are the controls being followed? Are we keeping the confidence in the organization because we have a strong governance culture and leadership is stepping up to bat at this time of crisis? And how is that being communicated to the front lines? And then what's the general workforce culture? If you think about it, people are in fear right now. They're in fear for their jobs and the economy. They're in fear for their health, not as just themselves, but their loved ones, of their colleagues. How do we communicate and reinforce the workforce culture right now at this time and engage the front lines in that area? Understanding and being able to manage our culture is critical in a time of crisis, and being able to clearly communicate policies and let people know what are the boundaries are, what's acceptable and unacceptable is critical at this particular time with organizations. Organizations need to have consistency and usefulness in policy communications to the frontline employees. Some important design considerations is to make sure that policy and control communications, that they're consistent, they're accessible, the right language, and they're easy to find, and they're not scattered across 20 different portals, that people have one single go-to place to find policies that they need right now in their new working environments that are remote. It's easy to find that single source of truth on policies and controls and reporting issues like hotlines and things like that, that everything's usable and actionable. We want those frontline employees to be able to state, like the worker here at the desk, that the policies and procedures align with my job and are written in a language I can understand, consistently use terms, formatting, level of detail, help me produce the expected results. We want that worker to say that in normal business. We want them to be able to say that in the time of crisis too, as we be able to manage that. It's important that organizations today develop a GRC communication plan to the front lines in a time of crisis. First, the first step is formulating that implementation plan of what are we going to implement as our operational resiliency plan in a time of crisis. What is that plan going to look like? And so we define key topics that are covered, including description of impacted stakeholders as a result of the crisis, identification of cross-operational implementation teams to implement the operational resiliency plan and engage the front lines. What are the barriers to implementation? Assessment of effect on other policies, procedures, and processes as we have to adapt to a changing remote office environment and workers that are working from home. What other areas are impacted? Implementation of and monitoring of new risks that are emerging because of the change in the economic environment and changing of the remote office environment and changes in business processes and regulations. And how does that impact our key risk indicators and triggers? And what are the different communication dates and targets? When we understand our broader GRC plan, and we'll talk about that a lot in the next webinar in the second line of defense, we then can clearly define what our communication plan is. This identifies who needs to be informed when and how. What are our different audiences out there for risk and compliance in the organization? What audiences are high risk, medium risk, low risk? What do we need to communicate to the doctor or nurse in the hospital, to the teller at the bank? What do we need to communicate to managers? So we need to identify who needs to be informed and when and how they need to be informed. We need to help tell the story in context of role and operations in a crisis, communicate value and importance of policies. What are the significant changes affecting each audience in a time of crisis? What are the upcoming challenges as we move forward with the business over the next few weeks to months? And what support tools are available? From there, we need the training plan to be able to train those individuals as well on new processes in the environment, what's expected of them. And then what's the implementation timeline? What's the proper approvals? And what are the different checklists that fall out of this as well to execute on that implementation plan? And building that communication plan in a crisis, we want to clearly establish what the goals are. What are those frontline, first line of defense employees and managers out there? What are our goals to be able to communicate to them, to be able to mitigate and manage our most significant risks? What are our different audience types, from operational management down to frontline employees, to different types of roles, sales, accounting, call center, whatever it might be. What are the things we need to communicate to each types of audience? Are there high risk and medium and low risk roles within those audience segments? What are the resources needed, such as a singular portal, to be able to communicate assessments, reporting issues, communicating policies that are revised and controls? Well, what are the resources needed? How do we make it accessible and easy to access so people don't have to try to, find the policy across 20 different policy portals? It's easy there in one spot. It's accessible. How do we measure and monitor the communication plan, the reaction of employees over time, align it, and get key stakeholders like executives to back it up and enforce it with their employees? From there, we execute the communication plan in a time of crisis. Some areas of policies and control changes, we need to just make people aware. Here's the revised policy, here's the revised control. You need to be aware of this within your particular business process. Others are a little more risky, let's say, higher risk policies and controls. We need to get some type of acknowledgement and attestation, while other areas might require some more scenario type training with employees as well in a time of crisis. So from there, we need to quickly understand what are the different types of risk roles. And we're looking at the frontline employees. You take something like patient safety right now in a healthcare environment, and everybody's high relevance. That it doesn't matter where you're at in the healthcare environment. Patient safety, particularly around the pandemic and things like that, is a high risk role. And now, before the crisis, that might not have been as quite the same. The level of patient safety that somebody in the lunch cafeteria needs to understand might be a very low relevance role, while somebody with a doctor or nurse is going to be high relevance. But right now, patient safety is a grave concern with anybody that steps foot into a hospital in this current pandemic. In areas of like privacy, working, whether it's financial services or retail or whatever it might be, you have high risk roles that are working from home that have access to, personally identifiable information that are governed by things like GDPR or CCPA or whatever it might be. And so you have very high relevant roles that have deep access into the personally identifiable information. You have medium risk roles that might have just occasional access to that. Low risk roles that very minimal access, and maybe some people working from home that don't have even access to that type of information. But what are the different types of risk roles that we have for our different policies and controls to the front lines, and how have those changed and evolved as a result of the crisis, and how does that implement our communication plans? Then we need to consider, how do we communicate with those frontline employees? And from there, we can have a pull as well as a push. A pull is where we have methods for employees to find the policy and get their questions answered. And so they might be questioning, it's like, okay, I'm working from home. What is the home office expense policy? Has that been revised because of the new conditions? Can I expense my internet connection or my printer paper or whatever it might be? And so they've got questions on that. So they need to go out and find that portal that has all the policies and controls related to their function and be able to easily find that and not navigate through 20 different portals. And that's that pull piece. The push is, well, we just revised that new home office expense policy to support the remote office workers in the current crisis. We're pushing this out to everybody. So everybody's getting a little email and alert that the new policy's out there. They got to read it and acknowledge it and do some type of attestation back that they've have understood it in the environment. That's a policy push. And organizations right now in a time of crisis needs both. Because those employees, even if we push the policy out to them, they might come back 2 days later with a question because they couldn't remember some piece of that, and they need to be able to find that. And we need effective mechanisms to be able to communicate policies and controls and processes for reporting issues and incidents out there across the organization in a time of crisis. We need that strong policy portal, that GRC portal. Like our host today, Risk Connect delivers, that can bring everything into one interface that is good for the laptop or desktop in that remote office environment, to the tablet, to even the smartphone, where it's easily to navigate and find policies and controls and things that apply to the frontline employees when they need it, where they need it, whenever they need it. And that gets into the mobility piece that's become critically important as well within organizations, that we need to be able to engage employees, because not all of our employees that are working from home right now even have laptops. Some of them might be working off tablet devices or even smartphone devices. And how do we engage and interact on all these things and be able to support issue reporting and incidents, being able to communicate policies and controls and change processes and what proper behavior is, and enforce the ethical environment, and what is acceptable and unacceptable risk in a time of crisis. We need to engage employees wherever and whenever they're at right now in this time of crisis as well. So with that, I'd like to turn this back over to our host, Risk Connect, to hear some of the things that they're doing in this area.
Thank you very much, Michael. I really appreciate that. I know everybody on the phone today appreciates this type of information, and I know how difficult it is in this particular domain right now, and how important it is that good guidance get out there and that people get access to good guidance for things like preparation and response. I want to ask you a couple of follow-up questions for some of the things that you shared with us. Before I get into that, just a quick note about Risk Connect itself. You were kind enough to mention us several times during the course of your presentation, a little bit why it was so important for us to be able to bring you onto this series personally. Risk Connect, from a philosophical standpoint, is incredibly aligned with the message of this, particularly the idea of interconnected risk. There's just no way to be able to plan or to prepare or to report on risks with everybody using different systems, with everybody organizing their own fiefdoms along the lines of that house that you showed earlier in your presentation, where everybody's building their own ways. We've seen different departments using different types of documents, using different taxonomies, where even within the realm of GRC, none of this information is being collected and analyzed and used in a way that is useful. And that allows a lot of risks to live in a company's blind spots where you can't see them, because as you said so well, the reporting itself takes tens or hundreds of hours, at which point you are not managing risk, you are simply reacting to risk. Risk Connect actually takes this the step further, where we are the only platform, to my knowledge, that fully incorporates not only GRC risk-related data and initiatives, but RIMIS-related and claims related as well, bringing those two things together. So if you have something that starts off as an anomaly with claims data, you are able to understand the entirety of that event, of what's going on, by tracing it back to an issue with third parties, or tracing it back to an issue with compliance or governance policy that you have at your company, and be able to not just insure against it, but rectify it. If you're anything like Risk Connect, for those of you who are on the phone right now, and I know that this is affecting everybody out there, we are all trying to look for ways to get by. We're all trying to look for ways to see if we can cut out costs wherever we can. I did want to make sure that you were aware, if you are considering any kind of risk-related platform or any kind of technology like what we're describing right here, and you're looking for ways to save, we can offer something to make it just a little bit easier. If you come and contact us as a result of having registered through this webinar, I wanted to make sure that you knew that you have available to you a 15% discount off of your first year's licensing fees with Risk Connect. So I hope that helps where it can, to be able to allow to cut just a little bit of cost where necessary. Mike, I wanted to follow up with you on some of these amazing points, and I think the best way to do that is to speak about how this relates to our current moment. So some of these principles you gave were phenomenal, and I wanted to ask, first off, in terms of the companies that you're helping right now, in terms of the people that you interface with, and so forth, what are you seeing right now in the industry in terms of the range of how people were prepared coming into the COVID-19 crisis, how companies are generally responding to it? Do you see a lot of preparedness paying off? Are there things that you are learning now that you perhaps didn't realize before, having to do with watching people respond to this particular crisis? What are your general impressions and your learning so far?
Well, I mean, the first thing, which is more of a reinforcement of what I've been saying, but I think what companies themselves are learning, but I've been talking about this for a while, is that too many enterprise and operational risk management programs have been held hostage by IT security. Now, IT security is a big risk. Now, I cut my teeth in IT security in the business world back in the 90s. And so I understand IT security, and it is a big risk. But I've seen too many enterprise and operational risk management programs that are really IT security programs. And so it hasn't been on the enterprise risk register and monitoring things like pandemic risks or environmental risks or other health and safety risks out there, or quality risks, or a range of other things that can significantly hurt the organization. Some of the most significant areas that we've had of risk exposure have been low likelihood, high impact events like a pandemic. Those are the ones that takes businesses out of business. And these aren't new things. I mean, things like pandemics have been on the World Economic Forum risk reports and been talked about at Davos for years. And so these shouldn't be catching organizations off guard, but I'm finding that there's a lot of organizations that are completely devastated by this, and they have not been prepared. Their business continuity program has been focused on IT disaster recovery and hasn't really had any type of focus on pandemics and the nature of what we're up against right now. Now, there's been some quick reaction, and organizations are responding rapidly to this. But that's one key thing that I'm finding. I'm finding that a lot of people are finding that their processes, and particularly manual processes where document spreadsheets and emails or policies scattered like in 20 different portals like I referenced, that just catches people unprepared. The other thing that I find coming out of this that really frustrates me, and it gets back to the first point I was making, and I blogged on this last week, but this is not a black swan event. Being unprepared for risk does not make it a black swan. Now, for those that might not understand a black swan risk event, a black swan risk event is something that is unforeseen. It comes from the European nature of swans being white. And so all swans from a European focus were thought to be white. There was no possibility of a swan being any other color but white. And then some European explorer goes and finds a black swan in some other part of the world. And nobody can be labeling this current crisis a black swan event because we've been talking about this for years. I mean, you've had Bill Gates talking about it for the last 5 years and more. We've had other pandemics like SARS and H1N1, and I've seen organizations a decade ago go through tabletop and scenario exercises coming out of other pandemics that don't necessarily have the same scale and impact, but they were trying to be prepared, but they quickly forgot about those. And we've had other issues like with the Spanish flu from 100 years ago and things that point to this. This is nothing new. This should have been on our radar. We should have been monitoring it. But that's the one thing that I'm finding, that a lot of organizations have been unprepared. A lot of them, of risk managers, I think, are calling it a black swan to cover their behinds right now, when they should have been more prepared for this.
So is this a failure of a lack of imagination, or is this a failure of process, or is this a failure of laziness? So if people were really legitimately trying to take a look into the future and say, okay, we're not going to do the next one like we did this one, kind of where do they have to look within themselves or within what's going on?
It's really myopia. It's having an enterprise risk management program that has blinders on, and that's thinking that our most significant risks we face are exclusively IT security risks. IT security risks are big risks. I'm not denying that, but they're not all the risks we face, as we can see in this current pandemic. And so we need to take the blinders off and get a 360-degree contextual awareness or situational awareness of risk that includes all aspects of risk to our organization's objectives, including pandemic and health and safety, but also environmental risk. For organizations that are going to ignore climate change and the environmental risk, you're going to have a lot more things to wake up to over the next decade.
When you take organizations through the steps that you outlined, first you need an implementation plan, then you need a communication plan, then you need where do organizations, when they're implementing that, either in the planning stage or when it finally comes down to execution, where do you find that organizations are struggling the most? Is it just, failure to have planned in the first place? Is it that employees are going through a great deal of change in their situation, and so communication is just hard from that? Where are organizations struggling in the processes that you laid out?
To me, the biggest struggle is what I've identified in having a single point of communication on policies and controls and change business behavior. Things are coming at them from phone calls and from emails and everything else. And when they go and try to get questions answered, there's 20 different policy portals and things like that. Organizations need a single point of reference on risk, compliance, controls, policies for the front lines right now in a time of crisis.
Let's talk about culture and trust for a second. You had that one very informative slide that laid out the various forms of culture that we need to be aware of. We're going through this just like all organizations are going through this right now. How do you maintain the culture, especially when you're not in the same physical space with one another? How do you keep these cultural aspects from completely falling apart in the mess of new circumstances for everybody. Um, where do you see companies doing this right? Where do you see companies that have put some practices in place to really be able to retain, at the very least, their workplace culture or some semblance of it? What would you instruct people listening now to put into place to help keep culture alive and thriving?
I would say that it's definitely good communication and reassurance by executives and leadership and all levels of management. To me, that is the number one uh, uh, area of reinforcing that culture, is to show that management is engaged. We're on top of this. We're working alongside you. Might not have all the answers, but we're agile and we're working with the organization, and we're here. If the employees are very concerned and they're not getting their questions answered, and management seems to be disengaged or missing, that's going to corrupt the culture. But it's those organizations that have management engaged in reinforcing the culture and comforting employees at a time of crisis. Those are the ones that are doing well. And again, it gets back to also the ones that are doing well are the ones that have good communication on policies. That when employees need questions on their changing business processes and things, those questions can be answered because the policies related to those processes, the controls in those processes, they're being updated and they're being communicated. And when the employee is looking for what that new policy is or how do I behave in this new environment, that those questions are readily answered because they have access to that type of information, and that reinforces the culture.
It seems like this would be very hard to do if there wasn't trust in the first place. And I know that different organizations span the spectrum of how much organizational trust or esprit de corps there was before this took effect. What are your thoughts on the role, especially of trust? I imagine that would be kind of the center of the bullseye into the engagement of the first GRC line of defense that you're talking about here. Without trust as part of your culture, you can't really talk about much else, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just absolutely critical right now, in that people know the people are empowered to get their jobs done in this new environment, but that they can also, when they have questions, get them answered. But trust comes down to it, to be able to let management communicate that we trust our employees, and trust you in a changed environment, and we're here for you and we'll answer your questions when you have them. And trust goes two ways. You have to build that trust down to the front lines, but then the front lines, also have to trust the management above too.
During this particular time, one of the things that's trickled back to us through talking to some of our customers and some of the people on the ground during this has to do with compliance specifically, and it has to do with how compliance and regulations have a tendency to change hundreds if not thousands of times a day. Absolutely. When you're in the middle of a crisis, that tends to compound because you have emergency statuses, for example, for different forms of regulations. You have an emergency relaxation of a regulation, or emergency deferral of a regulation, for example, in order to be able to get things, for example, to market faster, or in our case, medical equipment faster to the right people. And so I'd wonder if you'd comment a little bit about that. How do people stay on top as best they can of changes to regulations and compliance just as a normal best practice? And is there anything that they should be doing differently right now to be sure that they keep all of the information they need right in front of them?
Well, what you're getting at is going to be a lot of the focus of the second webinar, is teeing that up well, because it's the role of that second line of defense to stay on top of these changes and then to boil them down and communicate them into policies for the front line. To me, the frontline employees aren't the ones that necessarily have to monitor all the changes from the regulators themselves. That's really the role of the second line of defense, the subject matter experts and the different areas of market conduct or privacy or whatever it may be that need to be able to monitor those changes and apply them to the organization's context in a time of crisis. And so the question there, the answer to it tees up the next webinar perfectly, because that's the role of the second line of defense in a time of crisis, is maintaining that agility and understanding the dynamics of the changing environment and what that means to the organization to be able to communicate that throughout the organization.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll come back and readdress that when you talk in 2 weeks with us about the second line of defense. Along the lines of perhaps teeing up that conversation, I'm always interested in what permanent changes, if any, you might foresee coming out of this type of a situation. And surely with workers in new situations, testing out new technology for remote work and all of these changes to our culture and to our working style that we've had to go through, surely that can't all snap back after we're done. There's going to have to be some kind of permanent difference going forward. What, if anything, do you foresee about changes that will probably retain coming out of this?
I think greater support for a remote office environment, so that we're not only better prepared for the next crisis, but also just, I think a lot of companies that have been reluctant to really support a remote office environment now have the infrastructure and processes in place. And you'll see a lot of that remaining, which means it's an additional risk that they'll need to be managed on an ongoing basis in the future to be able to support remote office employees continually. So I see that as one thing that's definitely going to come out of that. We're going to see a lot of regulations. Of course, in life sciences and healthcare, I think you're going to see a lot of revised regulations to get greater agility, at the same time maintain safety within pharmaceuticals and life sciences and healthcare environments. We're going to see a lot of regulations coming out of this on operational resiliency. Already in the United Kingdom, we've had an operational resiliency regulation that has been proposed and for public comment, that for implementation by 2024, that impacts about 2,100 financial services firms governed by the Financial Conduct Authority, the Prudential Regulatory Authority, and the Bank of England on operational resiliency. I think we're going to see operational resiliency regulation go around the world and across industries, so that organizations have to be more resilient in a time of crisis.
Do you think that is just going to affect the kind of the second and the third, or do you think that some of those regulations perhaps coming forward would affect the first line of defense as well? Or are people going to have to get used to operating slightly differently or working slightly differently on the front lines?
Everything boils down to the first line of defense. I mean, the second line of defense is there to monitor risk, but the second line of defense doesn't own risk. It's the first line of defense that owns risk. Management, the line of business and operational management owns the risk of the organization, and the executives own the risk of the organization. And the chief risk officer and second line and third line of defense do not own risk. They monitor it and they help see across risks and things like that. And so whenever there's regulatory change and things like that, you bet it impacts the first line of defense.
Well, Michael, I believe that we probably are at the limits of our time here. I want to be respectful of your time, but I can't thank you enough for doing this webinar with us today and coming back and continuing the discussion with the second and third lines of defense over the next couple of weeks. For those people listening on the call right now, the next webinar will be in 2 weeks, and the third webinar will be 2 weeks after that. One last point about Risk Connect, as I was saying in the middle of this webinar, Uh, Risk Connect would like to follow up on these issues and questions with you. If you have questions for our speaker, for example, please submit them to us. We will get you answers to those specific questions. If you want to have a more detailed conversation about your company's own risk preparedness and risk strategy, please, I encourage you to reach out to Risk Connect. Speak to somebody here on our team. We would love to have that conversation with you. Michael, as we're wrapping up here, where can people learn more about you? Where can people keep up with everything that you're doing?
Well, my website, I mean, my contact information is right there. And so my email address, phone number, the website's www.grc2020.com. There's a LinkedIn group and people that follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter and things. It's all right there.
See the GRC 2020 newsletter there. I'm a subscriber. I encourage everybody to subscribe to that. It is an incredibly informative newsletter, and you can even separately subscribe to the Risk Connect newsletter, also an informative newsletter for issues like these. Michael, thank you very much for your time today. We're looking forward to having you back.
I'm looking forward to it as well.
All right, thank you so much.